Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And we're still expecting more people to join us as the webinar proceeds. But I think we need to observe the time, so we will begin. On behalf of the Center of Regulatory Excellence, or CORE, at the Duke-NUS Medical School in Singapore, I'd like to welcome you to the first in our 2021 CORE webinar series on contemporary topics. My name is John Lim, and I'm the Executive Director of CORE. For those of you who've joined us for our webinars last year in 2020, the overarching theme was unsurprisingly COVID-19 and the various regulatory and policy issues related to diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines development, and also the impact of the pandemic on patient engagement in East Asia. In the past 1 year since the start of the pandemic, and en route to the heartening situation of multiple vaccines becoming available in record development times, the global community has also witnessed the disheartening and sobering reality of over 100 million cases and over 2 million deaths from COVID-19 worldwide. And so as we enter the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic, expedited and ongoing authorizations of new COVID-19 vaccines are posing unique challenges to national regulatory authorities around the world and to governments and societies. And at the same time, we've seen unprecedented regulatory cooperation and regulatory agility through the application of emergency use authorizations and other similar temporary registration routes. While the unparalleled speed of vaccine development and international cooperation among governments, philanthropists, researchers, industry has produced several safe and effective vaccines, raising real hope for bringing the pandemic under control, governments, NGOs, and the WHO are now channeling significant efforts to secure sufficient supplies for all populations, especially in low and middle income countries. Amidst the ongoing loss of life and overwhelmed healthcare and economic systems, policymakers are faced with the challenges of prioritizing and allocating supplies to the most vulnerable populations while strengthening vaccine confidence in different regions and cultural settings. As Dr. Tedros of the WHO noted in his speech on the 18th of January, nearly 40 million doses of coronavirus vaccines had been administered at that point in at least 49 higher income countries. But in contrast, in one of the lowest income countries, just 25 doses had been given. And even among the high income countries, vaccine nationalism is a major concern, while limitations in manufacturing capacity have delayed ongoing immunization programs. And of course, concerns have also been raised about the efficacy of currently available vaccines because of the new, more highly transmissible COVID-19 variants. So in short, at the start of this new year, and with the impending Lunar New Year of the Ox, which is next week, there continues to be significant policy, scientific, access, and equity issues facing us around the world. And so it's timely for us to have a panel today of 5 highly qualified experts representing regulatory, NGO, industry, and patient perspectives to share their views with us. Let me introduce them and then invite each of them to briefly speak on the issues of global solidarity to enable access to vaccines before we go into a discussion around the questions that we received from the audience at the point of registration. So I'm delighted to introduce them in turn. Dr. Margaret, or Peggy Hamburg, is the former commissioner of the US Food and Drug Administration, and she works very closely with us in CORE as the interim chair of our advisory board. And I've known her for many years, and I'm delighted to have her with us today. Next, we have Mr. Luc de Bruyn, a former president of Global Vaccines in GSK, but currently holding the very significant position of strategic advisor for CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. Next, we have Dr. Suzanne Roth, advisor and chief of the Knowledge Advisory Services Center and the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the Asian Development Bank. Then we're delighted also to have Ms. Karen Villanueva, who's board secretary of the International Alliance of Patients Organizations, or IAPO, and the treasurer of the Philippine Alliance of Patient Organizations, or PAPO. And then We're also delighted to have Dr. Peter Honig, who's the farmer representative to the International Council on Harmonization, or ICH, and he's also Senior Vice President of Global Regulatory Affairs at Pfizer, and a member also of the CORE Advisory Board. So with that brief introduction, I would now like to invite the speakers in turn to share their views. And I'd first like to ask Dr. Hamburg, Peggy, to share your views. Over to you, Peggy.
Well, thank you so much, John. And I'm always delighted to be able to participate in CORE events, and certainly on this particular topic, which is so crucial and urgent to address and vital for all of our shared futures. Unfortunately, I do have to leave this session a little bit early. I'll try to be brief in my opening remarks, though, so that I can engage in as much discussion with the other very expert and distinguished panelists. You know, it is certainly remarkable how the scientific research community has come together during COVID to develop vaccines in record time, an array of different types of vaccines developed in different parts of the world. But as John noted, we now do have for use a number of remarkably safe and effective vaccines to address COVID-19, and many more are still in development. This achievement has been extraordinary, but we recognize that this is only a small part of really making a difference. We have vaccines now, but we're already struggling to ensure that they are getting to the people who need them. And countries rich and poor are facing this challenge of distribution. But as was noted in the eloquent opening remarks from Dr. Lim, the ability to ensure global access to vaccines is absolutely essential. It's essential for humanitarian reasons and to promote and protect health of people around the world. But it's also essential to the control of this global pandemic. A global pandemic really does mean that no one is safe anywhere until people are safe everywhere. And we need to address this in a coordinated way. We need to harness all the powers, of course, of the scientific enterprise, as we have seen happen in the development of these vaccines. But now in the delivery, we need to recommit in order to ensure that this problem can be addressed. And it's ever more crucial as we see the emergence of these new variants and recognize that as populations remain unprotected, not only will the virus continue to spread around the world, but we have to recognize the significant threat of new variants emerging in that context, which may undermine the very tools that we've now developed in our efforts to manage and ultimately control COVID-19. I do want to speak just briefly about the contributions of the regulatory community. We're talking about global solidarity, and I do think that regulatory authorities have stepped up in important ways to work together. Early on, coming together, recognizing how important medical countermeasures would be, and importantly, vaccines. Working together to identify the critical issues and concerns in the research and development process for vaccines, in identifying strategies and approaches that could help to speed the development process and enable effective and efficient review in an accelerated way. Also, what kinds of issues around scale up and manufacturing were going to emerge as we tried to compress the different traditional phases of vaccine development to expedite the process. And as we really recognized that we had to work in unusual ways to really be as effective as possible and respond to the magnitude and urgency of the problem before us. That meant really sitting at the table being part of public-private partnerships to make sure that governments, the academic research community, and industry were all on the same page, all moving in the same direction and working together towards these critical goals. And I think that, really the regulatory community has leaned forward in impressive and important ways. We've seen the benefits of the different kinds of international organizations like ICH and ICMRA in supporting these efforts. We've seen how a regional organization like CORE can make a difference, building on efforts to enhance capacity and training of regulatory authorities in the CORE region, but also mobilizing as we need to respond to a crisis of unprecedented size and urgency. So I really think that while the COVID-19 situation is tragic, it's devastated countries around the world, rich and poor, and we are really still at early stages of our ability to truly control this global pandemic. We can point to the contributions of science, which have been enormous, and the importance of regulatory authorities being part of the system for both preparedness and response, the importance of continuing always to be investing in regulatory science as a foundation for unexpected and vital future needs, and to be part of a partnership, just like the partnership of individuals represented on this panel today. So with that, I think I will end my remarks, except to say that as a US citizen, I'm also delighted that we, with a new administration, have recommitted to the international efforts to combat COVID-19 and end this pandemic. We have committed to investing in the ACT Accelerator and COVAX, and in some of the international entities that are so vital to efforts to make the vaccine available, including, of course, WHO. So while these remain dark times as we address COVID-19, I'm encouraged both by the new tools that we have and also on a national level, the recommitment of our country to global solidarity as we strive to enable access to vaccines during this pandemic and so much more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peggy, for those very heartening remarks, especially the reminder, of course, that the US is committed now to the world efforts to address the global needs. So thank you very much. And of course, over the years, as we've looked at the regulatory community, it's fortuitous that we put in place a lot of the cooperative mechanisms earlier that were able to be activated to respond to the pandemic, although it's responded in ways, I think, beyond what we thought would even be feasible when we thought of these things many years back. So thank you very much, Peggy. It's now my great pleasure to hand the time over to Mr. Luc de Bruyn to share your views, not only from your past experience in terms of vaccine development, but particularly now when we're thinking of global access from the point of view of CEPI. So Luc, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Let me build actually on what Dr. Hamburg and what yourself have said. I think we are at a very critical phase now in the pandemic with two huge challenges in front of us. The obvious one that was stated, obviously, is the supply of vaccines. And we all know that scarcity is the enemy of equity. And we will, I'm sure, discuss about that. The second one is this emergence of new variants and the fact that these are happening at the same time, actually, as countries are still in lockdown situations, makes the challenge even bigger. And they will have the way we deal with it will have huge bearings, actually, on the response and also on what we need to do in R&D. So what is the way out of this? And I indeed will use a bit of my experience of the industry and working day in, day out with CEPI and COVAX, this initiative of CEPI, Gavi, and WHO working together. to ensure development and equitable access. So let us go back 1 year. On the 27th of January last year, actually 2020, CEPI acted already on the basis of the fact that there were only 600 reported cases of COVID-19, but 3 existing partnerships were turned immediately towards focusing on COVID-19 vaccine development, rapid development. Moderna was one of those. In February then, we actually highlighted, or CEPI highlighted, and made a call to say, we absolutely need to invest in at-risk manufacturing capacity, because it's clear that there are no factories waiting to start producing COVID-19 vaccines. So companies needed to do at-risk investments. And that has only started pretty slow, actually, to engage in that. And we feel those today, because it's clear that in this crisis time, safety stocks were not built or was not possible to build. And therefore, every speed bump we feel in this supply chain. And then in March, CEPI, together with other partners, actually started making this call for global allocation framework for equitable access and fair access. And that's when COVAX was created. It was also for diagnostics and therapeutics, but let me focus on COVAX, which is this collaborative effort between Gavi, CEPI, and WHO. A lot was accomplished. It was said by Dr. Hamburg. I mean, if you would have asked me, and they did actually last year, will we have a vaccine by the end of the year? I had many doubts, actually, because we know the reality of vaccine discovery, development, but also the manufacturing challenges. So amazing effort, amazing accomplishments that we have now 5, 6 vaccines that actually are on the brink of being approved and that are actually already being administered. So that's never been seen before. So that's a good way forward to as a potential way out of this pandemic. Now, COVAX is the biggest multilateral effort since the Paris Climate Agreement. And I'm very proud actually to be able to share that I can say it's working. Why? Because, I mean, I invite you all to go to the Gavi website. Yesterday evening, they published the allocations of the first vaccines that will be shipped towards the low and middle income countries for Q1 and for Q2. And so it is happening, and we had set a target, or COVAX had set a target to have 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, to be distributed. And the distribution has started on the basis of criteria, but I will not get into the detail of that. So first of all, I think we should be proud of the immense scientific collaborative effort, but also this multilateralism that leads to the possibility to distribute those vaccines. That's my optimistic view of things. And I think there's no contradiction between optimistic, but also being realistic and facing reality. And what we face is a tension of 2 important things, actually. The first one is the tension between, should we vaccinate all the vulnerable and at-risk populations? And that's about 20%. And the tension with creating herd immunity, which is 70% of the population, at least, that need to be vaccinated, so that we can start life again and the economic activities. There's a tension between those 2, and it becomes obvious as a political leader in a country or for a region, you are confronted with that, because there also, it adds that you need to make a decision between distributing vaccines locally in your country and looking after your own population, and making sure that the moral, ethical, and economic imperative of looking after the world is also looked after. So my experience here is that, or my recommendation is that only political leadership at the highest level, G7, G20, together with enough financial support, can get us out of this equation. The second challenge is this new variants. I mean, I don't need to talk about the signs on this. We see all the reports every day of the UK variant being more virulent, and then the South African and Brazilian variants that even can reinfect people. So they spread very quickly. And here I think what we should have learned from the first waves is that we need to get ahead of this. And that means that we need to invest now in R&D, in capacity, in regulatory science, as Dr. Hamburg clearly highlighted, because we need to get ahead. We need to be faster than the virus, because as long as it keeps on circulating, and is more around, it will mutate even more. And that's a threat to everything, all the efforts that we've put in place in 2020, and they couldn't do those. So this time we need to absolutely go back to that collaborative effort, both on R&D, but also on the supply and allocation side and on regulatory science for the next generation of vaccines. The good news is that this work has started. This global collaborative effort has started on ensuring standardized assays, animal modeling, research, making sure that we have standardized sequencing and sharing all of that. But clearly a call to the regulatory audience here is to make sure that from the very beginning, again, regulators are involved, because my industry experience is that regulatory variations, whenever you change something in the process of your vaccine or in the manufacturing of the vaccine to be able to scale up even faster and more, that takes time, and we need to get faster. So it's important to work together and agree what are the requirements to go faster, because ultimately it's speed, scale, and access that are the true challenges to get out of first the acute phase of this pandemic, but also to get to the end objective of dealing with this pandemic and getting our life back and economic activity. So the bottom line, strong political leadership is absolutely needed at both national, regional, and global level. And the finances here are absolutely necessary, because the investment case is very obvious. So I look forward to the discussion, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. Very insightful. And there's this tension even between the optimism that you expressed and the realism, which I think is something we need to bear in mind. And I was really struck by the point that we have to start looking to address sort of even what we have to address the new issues that the variants are posing in the months to come. So thank you very much, Luke. And I think that sets a very nice stage to invite our next speaker, Dr. Suzanne Roth from the Asian Development Bank. Suzanne, for you to share your perspectives, both from a public health and economic financial perspective. So Suzanne, over to you.
Thank you very much for having us here from the Asian Development Bank. So I'd like to start, maybe we can have the slides. But while we show the slides, I'd like to give you a bit of the context. We are working in the Asian Development Bank. Obviously, we were hit in our own business operations already last year in March. We're based in Manila. As you might know, Manila, Philippines, has one of the strictest lockdowns, and we had to basically ensure that all our staff, international staff, leaves the Manila and headquarters. So that imposed, of course, various challenges for us. And then in March, April already last year, we started to think about ADB's role to provide access to financing for vaccines, because it was clear to us that the vaccines would be a critical instrument to end this pandemic. So what we identified as the key challenges when we started working on the vaccine financing instrument was, number one, regulation. We had worked before together with John and Duke and the core Duke-NUS actually on a collaboration to strengthen regulatory agencies in the region. So we knew the capacity of the regulatory agencies in this region. And we were wondering, how will we deal with rolling regulation? Developing countries, how well equipped will national regulatory agencies are to actually manage post-market surveillance, especially for vaccines for emergency use. We've also been involved in some of the responses here in the Philippines when the dengue vax situation happened. So that was important for us. At the same time, we were also looking at information systems, because we know that sometimes you can't even identify patients in developing countries. So there's a lot of discussions. How do we know who gets vaccinated, who needs to come back for the second shot, and how do we identify high-risk people? And the third aspect, of course, was a whole supply chain issue. We have worked on a vaccines project in the Pacific, so we also understand cold chain, logistics, and so on, especially, some of our clients in the Pacific countries. And of course, the fourth one, and you highlighted that, the whole issue of fair distribution and the whole point of politicizing the vaccine topic and conditioning opening the economy or opening schools to providing vaccines. So this is the complex environment we are working in. So if we can have the next slide, please. So what we decided to do is to take a systems approach and actually mobilize all of ADB's instruments and resources and say, well, we have a private sector arm. So let's look at in which kind of manufacturers or maybe along the supply chain, suppliers we can invest. And we created a trade financing mapping instrument where you can actually map the entire supply chain of several COVID-19 supplies. We then look at, strengthening regulatory systems, improve service delivery, and of course, strengthening digital health, combining loans, technical assistance, and so on. And then the next slide, please, what we did last year, which was actually quite revolutionary and I would say very innovative. The ADB decided to set up an Asia-Pacific Access to Vaccines initiative with $9 billion to enable countries to make advanced commitments, procure through COVAX, but also directly from manufacturers, and at the same time invest in strengthening their vaccine systems. We had to deal obviously with the eligibility criteria, and I'm speaking in the round of experts. You know how difficult this was at the time as things were evolving. So the question was, should we stick to very risk-averse public health focused measures, or should we accelerate speed, knowing the regulatory environment, at the same time also knowing that if we are not risk averse and we go with emergency use authorization and so on, we would need to ensure there is a proper risk management framework in place. I'm looking forward to that discussion with you experts here, how you see the balance between risk and benefit, because I think what is interesting, and I'm speaking as a public health expert, if we look at the absolute numbers, not that many people die from COVID in Asia Pacific developing countries because the populations are still relatively young. There seem to be other factors also leading to less severe disease. People get sick, but maybe less severe. And there are many other public health measures that come to play to actually manage the pandemic. And several countries in our region have demonstrated that they did very well. If you look at Vietnam or other countries. So now let's turn to the last slide, and I'm conscious about the time. And this is what what we are thinking and also proposing. And that is to really collaborate and enhance regional collaboration on this emergency use, on the delivery of vaccines during emergency use, and say, well, we need to have digital systems. And I'm part of the WHO digital vaccination certificate working group, where we actually can understand across countries who's vaccinated with which vaccine, so that we get faster data to actually have full evaluation on safety and efficacy, and then go to full marketing authorization. We know that some of the vaccine manufacturers are actually doing that themselves. We know that some of the Chinese manufacturers and vaccines, they sell the vaccine together already with a digital health system of full barcoding, identification of patients, so that the data on adverse events and so on goes directly to the manufacturer. So this is, I'm leaving here a few thoughts with everybody, and I'm looking forward to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And I think we should come back to that slide of yours when we have the panel discussion, because I'd like to hear the views of the other panelists on what you just shared. I think it's a very advanced, innovative way to deal with the issues. Now I'd like to go to our next speaker, who's also in Manila, Karen Pase Villanueva, who's representing the patient voice. And she's going to talk about patient engagement to address vaccine hesitancy. So Karen, can I hand the floor over to you? Very interested to hear your views.
Thank you, Professor Lim. And thank you very much for including the patient perspective in this very important discussion. So the COVID vaccine has been framed as the much awaited hope to end the pandemic, and many candidates have already been approved. While this provides hope and part of the solution, it also raises concerns over how vaccines will be deployed and accepted. So one challenge is vaccine hesitancy. Next slide, please. So the WHO defines vaccine hesitancy as a delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite the availability of the services, and it remains as a top threat to global health. And we as patient organizations now have a critical role to play to counter related infodemic and reduce the vaccine hesitancy by becoming effective messengers and advocates. Next slide, please. So in my part of the world, and this was already alluded by Dr. Roth, fear has paralyzed the vaccine landscape in 2015, vaccine acceptance was as high as 93%. But after the dengue vaccine controversy in 2016, vaccine confidence dropped to 32% in 2018. So clearly, we have a problem. Next slide, please. So what are some of the challenges in terms of vaccine confidence? So one is the expedited development of the vaccine. So there's a perception, at least from the patients and from the general public, that perhaps sufficient testing for effectiveness and safety is being carried out prior to approval for use in the population. So there seems to be a speed in which these have been approved. So that is an area of concern. And also the DNA and mRNA platforms in particular may also trigger anxieties and concern. Also, COVID-19 vaccines will lack long-term safety records, which may make many people nervous about taking them until they have been safely in use for some time. Adverse events resulting from a vaccine or seeming to result from it can also damage vaccine confidence. And unfortunately, not all pharmaceutical companies publish trial protocols or release results, as this may compromise trial methodology or damage their market competitiveness. A lack of transparency can undermine confidence, giving rise to conspiracy theories and reinforcing pre-existing public mistrust towards the industry. Second is information and communication environment, and the expansion of social media use provides opportunities for COVID-19 vaccine and misinformation to spread very quickly. Researchers illustrated that exposure to misinformation can result in lower reported intent to vaccinate for COVID-19, even among people who previously said that they definitely or intend to vaccinate. And this is true for the US and the UK. Misinformation that sounds scientific, or hesitancy, which is expressed by people with expert medical knowledge, such as healthcare workers, can affect vaccine confidence. For example, healthcare workers who feel hesitancy towards COVID-19 vaccines can be explicitly or implicitly transferred to patients. Also, with the COVID-19 vaccines with different levels of effectiveness, risk profiles, modes of delivery, prioritization schemes, vaccine schedules, and safety requirements, these complexities of introducing multiple vaccines in a short period can cause confusion and frustration if not communicated effectively. Third, and this was also alluded, is the politicization of COVID vaccine development and deployment. Vaccine development has become entangled with national and international politics, with some governments desiring to be seen to develop and deliver the first viable vaccines. This can undermine confidence, including raising concerns about rush development. Also, some governments have downplayed the pandemic and repressed news or rumors, even when they turn out to be true. These can undermine public trust and thus vaccine confidence. Next slide, please. So how do we start to increase vaccine confidence? First is to build up public trust by exercising transparency as far as possible, as early as in the clinical trial processes. Clearly communicate information and data in accessible formats. Share trial protocols and results whenever possible. And also adverse medical events. Share what vaccines are made of and how they should work. Second is being imaginative and compelling with communications and ensuring honest dialogue. So using a wide range of platforms, both off and online, including social media. Use clear communication, use languages and dialects when possible, use a lot of visuals, remind the public to act responsibly and think about accuracy prior to posting or sharing information online, especially. Use open dialogue, and also it's important to field questions and address anxieties from people and listen to their concerns and priorities. Be honest about uncertainties, what is known and what's not known. And of course, very importantly, is act together with other key stakeholders. Work with trusted influencers in and beyond public health, from national and international stakeholders. Also, look at possibly trusted alternatives apart from the healthcare providers and leaders. For example, in the Philippines, the church is a trusted influencer, and therefore they can be effective influencers and purveyors of accurate information. Co-design and co-create vaccination strategies with the citizens or with the patient groups, including in the prioritization plan. This will be important in building and maintaining public trust and confidence. Citizen juries are also a useful model used in past epidemics. Work with frontline healthcare workers, including non-biomedical healthcare providers, to address vaccine hesitancy. Finally, monitor vaccine confidence by using a variety of tools. Continuously collect and analyze feedback from communities to understand emerging and evolving misconceptions, rumors, and concerns. In parallel, monitor perceptions of the vaccination campaigns and of the vaccination experience. Next slide. And finally, as part of the patient movement, we need to increase dialogue and planning with patient groups and advocates, especially what vaccine deployment may look like, especially when there are complexities of multiple vaccines and different ways in which we work. Patient organizations must engage their broadcast and social media effectively and work on deploying their members, their networks, and other social capital to support the national and global immunization programs. Next slide. So thank you. Nothing about us without us. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Professor Lim.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that very important perspective and outlining all the key challenges we're facing in addressing the vaccine hesitancy issues. And I think, of course, the problems will vary from country to country because your proposals, I think, are valid, but I think they will have to be customized to the sort of risk and benefit concerns of different cultures around the world as well. Let's come back to that in the panel discussion. And now I'd like to round off the panel presentations with Dr. Peter Honig, who's speaking on behalf of ICH, as well as his experience as a Senior Vice President of Global Regulatory Affairs from Pfizer. Peter, over to you, please.
Yes, John, thank you. And greetings, everyone. And thank you, John and CORE, for the opportunity to join this impressive group of speakers, all of whom have appeared to master the mute button. So I have, which is impressive. I have a few slides and I'm going to move through them very quickly to set the stage for the discussion about vaccine development and this important topic of confidence in the vaccine and adaptable regulatory paradigms as well. I'm going to try to move as fast as the vaccine development timeline, which is shown on the next slide, with the full realization that development and regulatory clearance of vaccines are necessary, but clearly not sufficient to end this pandemic. Karen's talk was particularly relevant as vaccine hesitancy exists not only in developing nations, but also in highly developed nations, including the United States. And capacity will soon overcome supply, and vaccine hesitancy will be the next great barrier to achieve herd immunity and end this pandemic. As you can see, the Pfizer vaccine took 268 days from our decision to pursue it to the quest to the vaccine emergency use authorization in the United States. And this was greatly facilitated by two major factors. The first was genetic sequencing of the vaccine and publication by scientists in China in late January. The second was the fact that we've been working with our partner BioNTech on platform mRNA technology for influenza, which allowed us to rapidly pivot to coronavirus. And we were able to move expeditiously from preclinical testing, as you can see, of the construct, including non-human primate challenge studies, to phase 1 to initiation of a 45,000 patient global phase 3 clinical trial on June 24th, with results available on November 15th and the submission of the EUA application on November 20th. FDA moved equally rapidly to grant the authorization on December 15th. The UK beat them by a few days, and other nations followed closely thereafter. And this was done, I think it was mentioned by Luke a bit, through considerable at-risk pre-investment, not only in manufacturing, but also in clinical supplies, significant application of digital technologies and process improvements in data capture, cleaning, and sample processing, and unprecedented regulatory responsiveness, coupled with obviously nothing less than amazing investigator and patient enthusiasm. Next slide, please. So this is an eye-popping slide. It's from a recent Nature publication, just put up to provide context against past development programs for vaccines. It's pretty amazing when you look at the relative scale, and the coronavirus program is at the bottom right. And it's very conspicuous in its timeline differentiation from any other previously cleared vaccine, and shows that distribution and access planning no longer have the luxury of time to get ready to translate vaccines into vaccinations. As an aside, development against the emerging mutant strains is not so much a technical challenge for this platform technology. It's possible to have constructs against mutants in place in a matter of 4 to 6 weeks and in the clinic. But this needs to be informed by global surveillance and epidemiological modeling about strain emergence, dominance, as was said, regulatory pathways to permit rapid development and authorization. Next slide, please. So this slide is a pictograph of a publication from me and some of my Pfizer colleagues that may be of interest to this audience of regulators and drug developers, and illustrates some of the learnings, achievements from the COVID vaccine program that we shared, and may represent opportunities for a new normal development and regulatory paradigms in the future, including some of our public commitments. The first one is that participants in clinical trials need to reflect the racial and ethnic demographics of the countries and communities in which we operate. This is particularly important for patient confidence, not only in this vaccine, but for all medical products. It's an issue that we are now confronting in the United States. Number two, to expand awareness and access to our clinical trials and improve the experience of our participants. And this is a key way, we feel, to bring medical innovations to populations that don't have access to top-flight medical care. Number three, to share knowledge more broadly. I think the behaviors of some in the pharmaceutical industry feel that a lot of stuff that can advance knowledge more rapidly is competitive, when in fact it's really in the pre-competitive space, and sharing that more broadly will advance innovation for all patients. And then fourthly, to fully embrace digital tools for speed and quality. Next slide, please. Another pictograph showing an article that was authored by regulatory leaders of the major multinational pharmaceutical companies and attempts to capture and catalog the regulatory innovations and behaviors that we've observed during the pandemic that could be considered as durable innovation and a new normal going forward. And these include transformation of regulatory frameworks, advancing and acceptance of digitally enabled clinical trials, virtual monitoring and inspections, creation of a global platform for data sharing, which is underway under the Accumulus project, risk-based regulatory decision-making to address other serious and life-threatening diseases, as was done for the COVID vaccines, innovative clinical evidence generation practices, risk-based preclinical requirements, and risk-based and fit-for-purpose CMC requirements. All of those were employed during the vaccine development. All of those could be employed for other serious and life-threatening disease. And as some of you on the call are aware, many of these are currently being advanced through ICH, and we certainly hope there's sufficient traction there. Next slide, please. And this is my last one. And this slide shows again a pictograph of a real hot off the press publication just appeared last week from my group in Pfizer, and highlights some of the learnings we had from interactions with global regulators and their regulatory systems during the pandemic. And these findings include that This pandemic exposed significant weaknesses in some regulatory systems, such as significant lack of digital capabilities. However, the national regulatory authorities have demonstrated increased adaptability and resilience, which we hope really translate into durable innovation and practice. And they have the potential to really enhance regulatory capabilities and performance. So thank you for your attention. I hope you share my enthusiasm that however grim this pandemic has been, there may be a silver lining here in catalyzing significant changes in industry and regulatory capabilities and practices. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's a good point to end the presentations on, because I think this is something that we're all looking forward to in terms of how all the amazing things that we've been seeing in the light of this very tragic pandemic will actually be very durable and address ongoing issues as well as, unfortunately, future pandemics that we can expect to happen. Now, I'm conscious that Peggy has to leave in about 13 minutes. So, Peggy, I would just like to offer you the opportunity to pose any question or comment to the other panelists first before we pose some questions to you, which we received earlier. So, Peggy, anything that you would like to respond to in terms of what the others have said so far?
Well, I think it was a set of really fantastic presentations that I think all came together into, a fairly integrated set of observations and perspectives, all driving in the same direction, that we have an urgent need to address COVID, but we also have a real responsibility to make sure that there are lessons learned that get applied to the future, both to address future pandemics, which we know will come, but also to better align the tools of science and the regulatory process with unmet public health and medical care needs that abound, sadly, in our world and in all of our countries. So it is very, very exciting to see, the progress that has been made, can be made, and the commitment that I think we all have to doing so in the future. The one thing that I was sort of reflecting on a bit as I was listening, that I'd be curious to get some perspective on, is that it was mentioned, I think it was Luke, about the sort of intrinsic tensions that exist, and one of the and that some of those tensions can contribute either to progress or to problems, depending on how we recognize them and how we address them. One thing that I think has been challenging as we've gone forward is really integrating lessons learned in sort of real time and reassessing what we're doing as we go. And I think, some countries have been better than others at that. And probably some companies have been better at that too, and some public health systems. But, there have been trade-offs in terms of the rapid speed of the vaccine development, which, I think has been very, very important, and what we know. I don't think that we've in any way compromised scientific rigor, but questions like, normally we would have taken more time to look at dosing, to look at the appropriate intervals and the size of the inoculum. We might have structured studies in slightly different ways to learn more information about asymptomatic infection and the possibility of viral shedding and spread even in the vaccinated. But when the studies were being developed, we weren't as focused on that set of issues. There are other examples as well. And one of the questions I have is, how can we work together to really take advantage of the data that has been collected so far to dive deeper into some of the questions that have not been adequately answered, including what are the correlates of protection? But then also, how can we ensure that there are some targeted research studies that are done now where there are these gaps to make sure that near term and long term will be better positioned for the future? And how can international and regional entities help to support those efforts?
Thanks, Peggy. Actually, this ties in with a question which we received from our friend Larry Liberty from the Center for Innovation and Regulatory Science, and it links partly to this issue you raised, although you've gone into much more scientific, deeper issues, but it's the use of emergency use pathways and whether they've really been aligned or coordinated, because different countries are looking at different vaccines and approving things or even giving emergency use authorizations faster. And so this issue of alignment, coordination, as well as the issues you've raised of looking at the deeper scientific questions that may not have been answered in the speed of development. Can I pose these questions to Luke and Peter? How would you respond to this? And starting with what Peggy has raised. Luke first.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very good questions. And what I can say, the good news is that on the 28th of January, so just last week, CEPI has actually announced or made a call for proposals to exactly do those trials, you know, pregnant women, deferred dosing schedules, all the things that Peggy was mentioning, actually, that still are gaps in the research. But I must say that I would like to react on the fact on speed. I think we need to better explain how this speed was achieved, and I think Peter already alluded to it, because people think that shortcuts were made on trials or on numbers. Actually, it wasn't. It was just that it was prioritized beyond anything else, never seen before. So you were never in a queue to get a trial being done. Some countries did an amazing job to create a registry for clinical trials already so that they could tap into volunteers instantly, like they did in the UK. And indeed, we can learn a lot from that perspective. On the alignment for regulatory, I will listen and defer to Peter, who is way more versed in that. I think there has been unprecedented collaborative effort, but on harmonization and speed, I mean, we can do better. But let's not forget, we are doing this in a crisis. And if you don't make errors there, you are too slow anyway. Over.
Thanks, Luke. Peter, your thoughts?
Yeah. I'm concerned about time, but I think there has been clearly regulatory communication and collaboration and a bit of even emerging reliance. You know, the inspections of clinical investigator sites and manufacturing sites have been done virtually in many cases, but also shared and relied on by other regulators. So this is something I hope we can retain and move forward, because it's highly efficient. Especially amongst the competent regulators. One thing about the frameworks, that to Larry's question, is that the legal and statutory frameworks for emergency authorizations are not comparable across the countries. Even within Europe, if the UK is still part of Europe, you can correct me if I'm but the UK has, you know, a provision that's more aligned with the US emergency authorization. The EU doesn't have this. They have a conditional approval mechanism, so they have to go down that route. And similarly, the other countries around the world have different frameworks that we have to negotiate. The good news is that many of them, if not all of them, have accepted a common data package and not required additional or novel requirements. So the format of the emergency use application in the United States has been accepted by many nations around the world. So that has expedited review and approval. And it's very clear. It's very clear they're all talking to each other, the regulators. So they're sharing their concerns, they're sharing their knowledge, they're sharing their insights, which is great. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. One more question for you, Peggy, because I know you have to leave soon. So Peter raised this point, and I think others also raised this, that we're doing things at great speed, but in fact, the lessons we're learning and the publications that Peter mentioned really speak to the way of changing systems to this new normal in the future. What are your views on this from your perspective, you know, when you formerly, as former commissioner of the US FDA, and what you see now in the current environment?
I think it's absolutely true. And I think, as he said, it's one of the silver linings. We have to recognize, of course, that it will only be in a crisis like COVID-19 that we're going to see the kind of infusion of vast sums of money and the willingness to take huge risks, such as occurred with manufacturing. So I don't think we're going to be able to replicate, this R&D and develop manufacturing process, on a more routine basis. Though I think there are lessons learned that can and should be applied to other major disease challenges that aren't unexpected emergent pandemic, but the burden of disease is at least as crucial, and there are a number of diseases that come to mind where we still haven't adequately addressed them from a science, medicine, and public health perspective. Neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's, is one that looms for all nations. That's, going to have already is having huge health, social, economic implications, and we're not adequately addressing it. So I think we need, some targeted efforts that build on the kind of experience we've just had. But even in terms of how we structure clinical trials, there's a lot that we've learned that needs to be applied. We've been able to really shift, some of the ways that we think about the stages and phases of clinical trials. We've been able, I think, to push the clinical trial experience out more to where people are, rather than making people come to elite academic research institutions. The use of digital tools, the kind of regulatory harmonizations and alignment that was just noted, absolutely crucial to the future, because so many of the diseases we're dealing with, the products we're dealing with, and the companies we're dealing with are multinational, and we need to have a more integrated approach. So I think that, we are learning a lot. We need to continue to build on that knowledge and apply it in other domains. And I think we have to continue to have this sense of real dedication and urgency across, different sectors and across borders about the importance of harnessing science and technology to address these critical health problems. And I hope that actually, in the broader context of the work that we all do, including the political world and the world of economics and investments, that there will be a renewed appreciation of the centrality of health. I think often health is an afterthought. Health is a driver of everything else that's important to us as people, as communities, as nations, and as a global community.
Thank you very much, Peggy. I know you have to run off to your next meeting, and thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you with us, and we wish you well for the rest of the day ahead.
Well, thank you. And now that I'm leaving, everyone's backgrounds will be aligned.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Bye-bye, Peggy, and see you soon. Yeah. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Now, I'd like to move the conversation back to what, in fact, it does pick up certain points that have been raised about data and digital tools. And Suzanne, you began to talk about this, and you had that slide at the end of your presentation. I wonder, I'm not sure whether the rest of us fully remember what was on it. Can you sort of summarize it verbally for us? Because I'd like to hear the responses of Karen, Luke, and Peter to what you were saying in the context of what the bank is trying to do.
Well, I'm not saying that we are already trying to do it, but it's one of the thoughts we have, and that is that by financing vaccine procurement and delivery in various countries, if we had a trusted information system, and we could across these countries see which vaccines have been given to whom, and basically supply the manufacturers, even without us being an intermediary, this could be also WHO or someone else, to the manufacturers, then this could expedite how fast they get data to actually go to full market authorization. So that's the thinking we have. Basically, instead of going alone as a country and doing this by yourself with your national regulatory agency, you would do that collectively across, sub-regions, ASEAN, or even the bigger Southeast Asia region. or Central Asia. So that's one way to think about it. And of course, it would also accelerate any progress we can make on smart vaccination cards, which will be required to actually also recognize each other's vaccines, because every country will use different ones. And especially for migrant workers, this will be very difficult as they work in different countries to have mutual recognition. And of course, we need to make sure there is a standardized way to monitor adverse events. And at the same time, we also actually really need to have better collaboration on the disease surveillance, because even that, I would say, we only see the tip of the iceberg. And as long as we don't see the full picture of the epidemiology of SARS-CoV-2, then we can't really say how effective our vaccines are in the real world.
Thanks, Suzanne. So this is a very stimulating proposal. Actually, I'd like to hear Luke's view, because this would obviously have significance from a CEPI, Gavi perspective. I suppose my first question is, how realistic is this, do you think? I mean, it's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, well,
your thoughts?
Well, I think it's indeed a fantastic idea. I think the first thing that we need to look after now is absolutely the pharmacovigilance piece, because that's the most important one, I would say so. The question is, what is the role of the globe versus the region versus nations? And it's to find, I mean, I'm convinced one of the lessons learned, and I've gone through pandemic flu in 2009, Ebola, West Africa, and so on, is that we should not dream of some international global organization who does it all and that the world will move along. I don't believe in that. I think we've seen the power, actually, and I can use the example of African Union, for instance, or even for the first time Europe, because in pandemic flu they didn't work together. This time around they do, is the importance of regional organization. And so my suggestion would be to explore what you were saying, Susan, absolutely from at a national, regional level, and then there can be more easily a global coordination, but not starting from a top-down that this should be happening. But I'm interested in Peter's view on that as well, of course. But I mean, very important. Digital has enormous power to accomplish this. First, from a pharmacovigilance perspective, and then actually to create and to answer to Karen's worries, which is to reinform and create feedback loops on how good that vaccination strategy has been, because that's mostly lacking. We think the job is done by administering the jab. No, we need to continuously create feedback loops of efficacy, safety, impact of those vaccines, and digital will absolutely help a lot for that. So hope that answers a bit, but over to Peter.
Thanks. And Peter, as you respond to this also, can you begin to pick up what you were also alluding to at the beginning of your talk, as Karen was talking about vaccine hesitancy, because these issues of data, even pharmacovigilance, monitoring, reporting to the public, these are such critical things, but firstly, not easy to always gather the data in different contexts, but to share it in ways that are appropriate, which may not sort of cause more concerns, because I think Karen was saying we should be very honest and transparent, but there are pros and cons, I think, to that. Peter, your thoughts?
Yeah, leaving aside the polarity in some countries, let me just be honest here, the United States, about the validity of science and public opinion of science. I think transparency is critically important. If you're fortunate enough to get a vaccine in the United States, you will have access to an app where you can report your progress post vaccination 1, post vaccination 2, and this all goes into a central database that is monitored by CDC and other authorities. And the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States, just had a recent meeting last week where they publicly discussed the safety profiles, emerging safety profiles of the vaccine, all with the intention of supporting public confidence in the vaccine. Suzanne's concept is a noble one. I wonder how realistic it is to start at the top, but the proof of concept is going on now in Israel, in the nation of Israel, where they're having significant penetration of vaccine across the population. It's a political force of will, and they have electronic medical systems that are all linked, and they're able to answer a lot of basic public health questions like transmissibility, cluster breakouts, but also, what is the tipping point for herd immunity, emerging mutants? It's really amazing to see how a closed system like Israel with electronic population data capture can answer and really be a proof of concept for what Suzanne has been talking about. Yeah, so I agree. It would be a great thing to do. The United States is a bit fragmented at this point. We're trying to use some of our linked data systems to answer some of these questions in collaboration with and supplementing what we know from clinical trials.
Thanks very much, Peter. Karen, as you've been listening to this, in terms of the issues you raised about vaccine hesitancy and also vaccine confidence, the sort of scientific issues that have been surfaced and the very optimistic things we've heard from some of our speakers today, how do you see this being translated into sort of messages which would make a difference in terms of patients from your perspective in IAPO? Sorry, you have to unmute yourself, Karen.
I also wanted to pick up on the point of representing ethnic groups. I think that's also one major concern of patients around the world, or also particularly in Asia Pacific. And that's why I also like the idea of Dr. Susan Roth about regional cooperation and regional sharing of data. So I wanted to ask both Luke and Dr. Peter, how do you decide which ethnic groups get to be studied, and is it based on market potential, or what is it based on?
Peter, you want to go first, and then Luke? Yeah.
Yeah, I could start. So with any clinical trial, you have this balance against getting the trial enrolled and completed and answering a scientific question versus having this broader representative demographic participation. With the COVID vaccine trial, we made an a priori decision that we needed to have representation consistent with the demographics of the nations in which we were conducting the trial. This was a decision, and it was the first problem to solve for. Rapid enrollment was the secondary problem, secondary challenge. So in the United States, this was accomplished. It was amazing because we've had traditionally very difficult challenges in getting adequate representation from underrepresented communities, African American communities, Native American communities, and down the line. And we worked with thought leaders in the communities, investigators in those communities, and we basically incentivized our investigators to make sure they enrolled those patients. And it was quite an, I think I made it clear in the papers that I presented. It represented a big learning to us. You get what you incent. And when you incent the investigators and you work with the communities, we actually achieved it in the United States and in the other countries in which we conducted the vaccine trials. So, it's this balance, but, if it becomes a priority, it's doable.
Thanks. Luke?
Well, I have not a lot to add because I agree with what the points that Peter made. So I think if we think about the future, it's this proactive engagement actually and registries that could help to be even better at it. But I think indeed the companies did already a very good job of having representation of the different groups so that conclusions can be drawn on efficacy and safety in those groups. But going forward, thinking forward, we should absolutely, this community engagement should happen during peacetime, let's put it that way, so that registries can be built very, very quickly, taking into account all those representations.
Luke, while I'm with you, I want to swing to some of these questions on the access issues, and these are more specific because you mentioned the politicization and the need for leaders to make decisions. So this issue of the EU to sort of block exports of COVID-19 vaccines produced in the EU to other countries, because we saw in this region that Thailand is therefore just going to obtain vaccines from other sources. But what is your view on this? Because it does seem to then create more barriers. And let's say from the view of CEPI and from the perspective of COVAX, what is your perspective on these kind of decisions taken by regions or countries?
Well, let me share my personal view, because I cannot speak really on behalf of CEPI or COVAX. I'm an advisor to them. But, you know, the observation of export controls has been more of a threat than anything else at this moment. I do not applaud this. I think it's not a good action to show your teeth, actually, when you are in a global collaborative effort. So that's for sure. Secondly, it's important to keep everyone in a collaborative effort around the table. And therefore, again, these kind of actions do not help. What it does teach me, actually, and will teach the future, is again to this comment I made earlier on the regions will become way more important. And I think regions will think very hard about not only where capacity is spread geographically so that they can ensure not nationalism, but really regional. Secondly, where raw materials are sourced, I think that will be more diversified. Again, not commenting that this should be nationalized or anything, because that won't work, that wouldn't solve anything. But I think you will see a regional effort. But to answer in short, I don't think that export controls are a solution to the problem that was being set forward. It's actually dialogue and continuous collaborative effort that will get out of this.
Suzanne, from the bank's point of view, and maybe from a public health perspective, what are your thoughts on this? Also, there was another question on, which I don't know whether you'd like to try and answer this. Will countries that have acquired more doses than needed to vaccinate their populations donate the extra doses to other nations? I mean, that's a rather, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, maybe we start with the second one. There's already, this kind of dialogue is already happening. So when we discussed our Asia Pacific access to vaccines facility, some constituencies who sit in our board, member countries, developed member countries, wanted to ensure that we could also, kind of channel these donations, or even, countries want to sell it, that we could channel it through such a facility. So I think this could happen. There's of course also a diplomatic and political dimension behind this. On your other question, which was about export, I mean, that's of course there's no, right now is not the moment for nationalistic actions. We have to act local and think globally, and I think that is, to some extent, we had a very, I think, positive panel here, optimistic, sound very optimistic, but to be honest, there are, I would say, several shortcomings that we did not think enough globally in the way we managed and reacted to this pandemic. And I want to say that the collateral damage is immense. 260 million people alone in Asia Pacific are pushed into poverty. Around 1.3 billion children are not going to school. Many of those will never go back to school. So I think we have to be aware of these collateral damages.
Thanks, Suzanne. Peter, a rather obvious question, I think, which has been raised, this issue of the sort of, I think, Pfizer's manufacturing capability and the delays that have been created. Any comments on this in terms of what's happening for the manufacturing and whether there's a kind of catch-up process?
Yeah, well, we, as you know, we're going 24/7 on our manufacturing sites. The two major finishing sites are in Kalamazoo, United States, and in Purs, Belgium. Just an example of unintended consequences of what looks like a good idea. We do our release testing in the United States for our Purs supply, so we were not able to get those doses intended for Europe out of Europe to do batch testing and release for Europe. It's just, I think regulators and politicians need to think, that this is a global enterprise and not just, everything exists in their four walls. But as you saw, we have now collaborations with other companies to scale up manufacture of the vaccine. Novartis just came on board with manufacturing capabilities. So hopefully we'll be able to meet those supplies and those commitments.
Thanks very much for that clarification. Well, we're sort of running out of time. I don't know whether we've been able to fully cover or done justice to the topic. That could probably have taken us another hour. But Suzanne, you've raised your hand. Please.
I would like to ask one question about something very specific about the WHO emergency use listing procedure, which is of course also innovative. We haven't done this before. We had a discussion before. We haven't done this for innovative products yet. And I would like to hear, especially from from Peter, but also from Luc, how do we give this emergency listing with a certain responsibility of the manufacturer to take care of the post-market surveillance and risk management in country, or how do we handle the emergency use listing from WHO in how do we manage certain risk, especially in developing countries?
I don't know if I can intelligently answer that question. It's complex. The answer is yes.
Yes, right? The answer is yes. It's part, right, of emergency use listing. Part of it is to have a risk management plan.
Absolutely. No question about that.
Thank you.
Luke?
Well, nothing to add. It is absolutely, I mean, it's again to that pharmacovigilance, and I think that's where the focus should be of those countries where vaccines are being rolled out, rather than trying to redo what the regulators have done at a regional level. So it's really to hone in on that pharmacovigilance and feed that back into the system.
Well, thanks very much. Can I just ask each of you to maybe share one key takeaway that you would like the audience to just remember from this panel before I just make some closing remarks? And I invite Karen to start first from a patient perspective.
Yes, thank you, Professor Lim. So I just wanted to emphasize the importance, again, of involving patient groups, especially in addressing vaccine confidence, and working also with patient groups in terms of reaching out to the community, getting feedback. I think it's very critical that there's a feedback loop to make sure that on the ground, the vaccine deployment is implemented properly. And in terms of pharmacovigilance, it will be from the patients, by which that information will be fed back to the manufacturers. So that's all. That's from the patient view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter?
Well, I think Peggy said it best, but we will hopefully emerge from this with the new normal way of developing medical products for serious and life-threatening diseases. We realize now it's an ecosystem that requires complete collaboration and input from patients, regulators, investigators, governments, and hopefully there is a commonality of the will to move with such light speed that we have for the vaccine with other medical products that address serious and life-threatening conditions.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Yeah, I would like to say the same, in a way that we shouldn't forget that there are around 60 million preventable diseases, 60 million preventable deaths every year, which we could easily prevent if we were moving at the same speed of light in developing prevention and treatment methods. And I also would like to say that it's not only vaccines what we need to have the right prevention measures, and we know those now. There are ways to prevent people from getting sick and getting also severely sick.
Thanks very much. Luke?
Well, I'll keep it to the now, which is let's make sure we learned already from last year and get ahead of what potentially those new variants could do, and get better actually even at distributing those vaccines that we already have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you, and of course, Peggy, who joined us earlier. You've really given us an enriching perspective on this issue of global access, many perspectives. I think what I'm also realizing is that, of course, it's just the beginning of the second year of the pandemic. And whatever we thought we were facing as a kind of uphill battle at the beginning of last year, we realized there are new mountains to climb in a way as we go through this year. There have been very positive things which you've shared. As Suzanne said, it's been a very optimistic panel, but I think there are new challenges that we will have to work our way through in the course of this year, especially to deal with these vaccine nationalism issues, vaccine hesitancy, variants, and really work, especially through the very critical work that CEPI, Gavi, and COVAX are doing to ensure that vaccines really reach out and are accessed by those in the low and middle income countries. So, well, thank you very much to all of you. Keep up the good work and all the things that you're doing. And I look forward to keeping in contact with you as we continue through this journey. And we certainly hope for much more light at the end of the tunnel given the good signs we've seen, but many challenges still to be addressed and faced. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. And I wish you well, keep safe, and also for those of you who are celebrating the Lunar New Year, happy Chinese New Year of the Ox as well. So thank you very much, and good night.